Good morning, everyone. It's really, really nice to be here. Thank you to colleagues at Advance HE for hosting this session for us this morning. I hope it will be really interesting. I've certainly found this project really interesting. As Danny mentioned, I work for Universities HR, so the vast majority of universities in the UK are members of UHR, and that means that HR colleagues working in those universities are automatically members themselves, and they can come to our events and join our networks, and we work with them on a wide range of issues. A little while ago, we partnered up with Returning Works to promote the survey, which they're going to be talking about today, to our members, because we know that colleagues working in universities are working really hard to develop policies and guidance on supporting staff with caring responsibilities. And those colleagues also work on Athena Swan submissions and all kinds of other projects that go on in their institutions to support their staff. So we're be part of this. So the panel this morning, we've got two sector experts really who are going to talk to you about both the Returning Works survey and what's come out of that, but also wider issues around supporting staff with caring responsibilities, particularly around being parents. So we're first going to hear from Claire Burgess, who's an associate at Returning Works. Returning Works, she'll tell you all about what that organisation is, but basically they work with other organisations to create inclusive workplaces for parental returners. And then we're also going to hear from Jane Van Ziel, who is Chief Executive of Working Families, which is the UK's national charity for working parents and carers. So they have a wealth of experience in this area. So we're going to hear from them, and then we're going to have some chance for a Q&A. So Danny has already mentioned, please use the Q&A button to pop your questions in there, because that means we'll be able to easily see them as opposed to in the chat box. So we'll be able to go through some questions at the end of the presentations. We've got about 40 minutes. So firstly, I will hand over to Claire, who I'm sure will introduce herself and take you through the work that Returning Works have done. So Claire, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Really lovely to see everybody here today in this virtual room with us. So yeah, I'm really delighted to be here with you and just share a little bit about the survey that we did last year, give you some highlights of that, and the full report of that will be out for you to access later on in the summer. Okay, next slide, Sally, please. Okay, so yeah, welcome. You hopefully have the presentation slides that were sent out the back end of last week. I know I've only got a fairly short amount of time this morning to talk to you, so but you'll have a chance to read through that information when you get a chance after this as well. Okay. As a reminder, we've got a Q&A at the end, so if you've got any questions, please have a think and note those as you go along. So what I'm going to be talking about, really brief bit about us and what we do, some headlines, findings from the survey that we did. I'll say more details will be out with that in a few months' time. We're going to look at actually what the survey told us about key challenges for the sector, as also areas of strength, areas where people are going really well. Some insights we did some follow-up interviews as well, and then our suggestions for what's happening next. So a little bit about Returning Works, Sophie's mentioned us already. We work with lots of different organisations across different sectors. What we focus on is we really want organisations to be able to have supporting environments. It's not enough to be able to just talk to parents and mums in particular about this is how you can actually get the best out of your career once you're a parent, but also working with the organisations. So we do both sides of things. And we have, particularly over the last few years, focused with a number of higher education institutions on working one-to-one with parental returners, but also running workshops for managers, manager awareness workshops, manager awareness webinars as well, really sharing some of the knowledge and experience that we've got so the organisations can be as supportive as possible. So that's our aim. We really want these family-friendly environments to help women to thrive in their careers. So next slide, please, Sally. Okay, so these are our key findings, and some of the background will tap into things that that Danny mentioned already at the beginning. Next slide, please. So we've heard this already, and we know this. A lot of people know this from their own experiences, and this comes to some of the things that Danny's just been mentioning. Okay, yes, the sector has progressed, but there is still work that can happen. Very much, again, looking at that kind of graphic that was presented at the beginning of the session today, we still get this disparity. We still get this idea of a motherhood penalty as well. And what we wanted to do in this survey is get a sense about what are actual lived experiences, what are people experiencing, what can they tell us, what's going really well. You know, we didn't want to just focus on what could be done better. We really wanted to capture what institutions are doing this really well, what can we learn, what can we share as a sector. That's really, really important. And also thinking about what can we suggest to departments such as HR, such as EDI, that actually can be looking at this from a business perspective as well. We've seen the research, like you say, that we've seen already about this gender pay gap, but also the Office for National Statistics research shows us that women take on higher level positions at a much lower rate once they've become parents than they would have done without being parents. So again, we're looking at what can we do to support people here. Next slide, please. So this is what we did in the survey, and you may have been someone who was contributed to that, and if you were, then thank you. So it was last year. It ran from the 5th of June to the 31st of July. 172 responses across 58 institutions. We had a mixture of free text and multiple choice questions for people to answer as well. And really looking, as it said there, what progress are we getting in these supportive workplaces, but also thinking about what are the barriers. We had a range of professional services and academic staff and a range of different job functions that you can see there as well. Approximately 24% of respondents were in academic roles, and the rest were across different job functions as well. Next slide, please. So this is a really high level summary. I could talk to you about this a lot this morning, but I'm only allowed 15 minutes. But actually, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, we will be turning this into a longer report that you'll have a chance to look at all the detail as well. So it was something that the report came out through, as Sophie mentioned, through University HR, shared by Advanced HE. We shared that as well with our social media and through our contacts too. So we try to get that out to as many people as possible. Key results, I'll whiz through this a little bit. So 44% feeling the organisation isn't making fast enough progress to have this supportive and inclusive environment for parental carers. So really thinking about what's the experience of a parent within these organisations. However, strong progress, and I'll read you a couple of stats. So 94% thought that actually institutions are really good at family-friendly policies, such as flexible working, so most are doing really well. 65% said they had an active parent network in place, which is great. 51% said the organisation was aware of the impact of caring duties. So again, acknowledging that, which is really good. But also these barriers to participation, and again, typical themes that we were seeing. So 78.5% said that they felt their organisation had a lack of awareness of the impact of motherhood on women's careers. 55% said the barrier was a culture or the working environment. 45% said there was a barrier because of the time being out of the workplace due to maternity leave. And 43% said a barrier was limited access to examples of best practice. So examples of role models or actually what is possible in terms of support. And so again, what people were telling us is that actually 77% said that they felt institutions could do more about trying to understand the issues or the lived experiences of expectant and returning parents. 62% said there was would prefer if there was talk about fair and accessible developmental pathways. Cultural change, that was 61%, and again thinking about this awareness of best practice. So there's a lot of positives that came out, but also we're finding these key themes of what could be done. Okay, next slide, please. So, thank you. That's all right. So what we did as part of this as well is we gave people an opportunity to let us know if they wanted to talk in more detail about this. And so what we did when people said that they were happy with that is we conducted 23 interviews with people who said, yes, I'm happy to talk about this a bit further. They were 30-minute interviews via Zoom, summer and autumn of last year. People from a variety of job roles, professional service and academic staff, really well represented across them. So we've got, what I'm going to show you in a minute is some insights from those conversations, which have been kept anonymous to be able to preserve that confidentiality from the survey. And again, very much thinking about elaborating on some of these thematic findings that we were seeing. Okay, so there's 4 key challenges that we're going to talk about in terms of what's going well, and then what people identified as not going so well. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first challenge was the overall strategic organisational approach. So what they were telling us in the survey is what's going well is that institutions have got policies such as enhanced maternity pay, flexible working can often be in place, not necessarily across the board, but people are seeing that. Some organisations are really good at when they hold their meetings to think about holding these meetings in core hours, thinking about school and nursery drop-offs when people can be there. So that was really positive. What we were told was not going so well was not having a sense of senior leadership buy-in. So not really thinking about actually this strategic approach in terms of parental inclusion and really thinking about the importance of that. So as a consequence is actually organisations don't really have much of a strategic plan, really think about, okay, what could we do as part of our overall approach here. Next slide, please. So here's some sense from our interviews around here, and I'm conscious of the time that I've got for this, so I'm not going to read you all of these, but you've got the slides to be able to have a look, and you can see that there's a mixture here in terms of really positive feedback that we've got from our interviews, but also some things about what could be done better. For example, how does it actually link in explicitly to maternity, and what can we do? What can we do practically? Okay, next slide, please. The second challenge that people were talking about was actually the networks. So what we found, what's going well, and we've also found this in our work individually that we do with institutions, parental and carer networks are often in place. There's a lot of institutions that are putting these in place, and actually the positive feedback that we get about the source of support to that is really, really critical. People are saying that's really, really key. And not just women in terms of parents, of course, thinking about parents in terms of the wider sense of being a parent and what that means to us as well. What people were saying isn't always going well is that actually these networks aren't always very active. And that could be a time or a funding issue, potentially, a resource issue that people were talking about. There's not always that feedback in terms of, okay, what's coming up in the networks? How can that be fed back in, linking back into that first challenge that we found as well? And actually what can happen is that parental mentoring programs can be asking people who are parents themselves, who then are quite often time poor, to support other parents. So it's not really solving lots of things. It could potentially be feeding back into actually other things that need to be looked at there. So really thinking about how's this going to work and how does it fit with everybody. Next slide shows us some things from the interviews. So that's got the wrong, right, that's it, you got it, thank you. Confused me for a second there. So again, you can see here that we've got some really positive examples of parental networks that are happening in organisations, but also it depends on what's available and what's allowed in terms of resource within the organisation. Okay, and again, you've got those to be able to read on your slides as well. Next slide, please. The third one is looking at manager allyship. So really thinking about actually when managers do understand that impact, then employees say that they're more likely to successfully re-engage. So manager understanding was really, really key part of this. What we did find, again, linking back to when we're looking at the bigger picture, there's not always that at an institutional level. So it can be very much dependent on people's individual area and their individual manager, the level of support, rather than actually this being something that happens across the whole institution. And again, we've worked with some organisations who offer parental transition coaching, but it isn't always something that is, again, offered widely. But when it does happen, we get some amazing feedback on that. But it's not something that's always possible or really considered as a norm really across the sector. Okay, and what can happen if this doesn't happen is we've got this, what we notice people telling us is about this maternity bias and discrimination. So actually some managers are really good at, for example, if development opportunities come up when somebody's on parental leave, then actually being able to involve them in that, whereas others say, oh, this happened while I was off and I didn't even know, and I would have liked to have gone for that role, for example, or I would have liked to have been part of this training. So again, it's really thinking about making sure that we've got that inclusive environment, that everyone is having access to these opportunities, whatever their situation. Okay, next slide, please. And again, we've got some snippets from our interviews here as well, very much about what we're finding in terms of best practice, and trying to get this consistency even within institutions and then across the sector. That would be our aim. And the last challenge on here, next slide please, thank you, is thinking about barriers to career development. So what we were told was that some institutions have got these really great funding schemes where it's looking at particularly people within the academic part of the institution, thinking about, okay, continuing research and being able to give them access to that. Some institutions have got mitigations in promotions criteria that allow for career breaks, because again, that can be an issue or a barrier sometimes. But what we were told isn't going so well is that there's not this tracking of career trajectories. There's not this thought about, okay, what is actually happening to our returning parents? And talking about this lack of role models, people working part-time, people in senior roles who are parents, and that can be barriers there as well. Next slide, please. And again, the things that we're hearing about from our interviews, and there may be some elements that resonate here from your own experiences too. So thinking about, actually, it can slow progression down, but also what can happen, what support is needed in this area. And this for us from the survey, but also from our other experience, is something that is really important, thinking about this career development and progression. So just really quickly, because I'm conscious I'm at the end of my time slot, our recommendations for this. So what we would recommend, there is a lot of best practice, there is a lot of progress, and we really want to acknowledge that. But it's thinking about having that concerted effort, being consistent across all education, and the lack of senior leadership or whole institution approach, which is a bigger bit of work. But really thinking about, okay, actually, what can we'd recommend having a think about manager support and allyship. We often work with people to have that standardized checklist for managers, what happens before, during and after parental leave, and that can be done at an institutional level, training in terms of having that awareness, sharing best practice. We also would recommend strengthening networks, really thinking about, okay, how are we going to make this work properly? How's it actually going to be meaningful? And then that support for returners. So checklist in terms of the comms to people coming on when they're returning, induction plans in returning to work rather than just expecting people to slot back in. And that one-to-one support as well is something that's really key. So we're going to have time for questions, but I'm conscious I want to pass over to the next speaker. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Claire. That was really interesting to see the outputs from that survey. I just wanted to address one question really quickly before we move on. Somebody asked in the chat, was the survey only open to women? And it wasn't. It was open to anybody within higher education institutions. We didn't restrict it, but we did find that a lot of the responses were from women who'd had experience of coming back after having children, but not all of the responses were from people who were parents. There were people who were working on policy and things like that as well. So just wanted to pop that in.